Imagine May 1945. The victory salutes have faded, and the world is celebrating the end of the most horrific war in history. In the streets of liberated cities, soldiers who were allies only yesterday exchange handshakes and souvenirs. But while euphoria reigns in the squares, an icy wariness has already taken hold in the closed offices of the intelligence services. There is no respite. It is during these first post-war months, at the turn of 1945 and 1946, that an invisible but ruthless race for information begins. For the intelligence services, this period became a time of feverish dossier gathering on one another. Yesterday's brothers in arms were rapidly becoming rivals in a clash between two superpowers. In Washington, the atmosphere grew more strained by the day. As early as 1946, American analysts were placing alarming reports on their leaders' desks. U.S. intelligence recorded a fact that caused serious concern. Soviet institutes were actively utilizing the labor of German scientists. The very specialists who had developed weapons for the Third Reich were now working to bolster the might of the Soviet Union. This discovery became one of the key triggers. The American leadership realized that Moscow was not merely rebuilding its shattered economy, but was also striving for technological parity and perhaps even superiority. In response, it was in 1946 that a dedicated system for briefing the president on the Soviet threat was established in Washington. These were no longer sporadic reports, but a systematic flow of data that shaped the image of a new enemy in the eyes of the White House. The declaration of the Cold War, symbolized by Churchill's famous Fulton speech in March 1946, merely formalized what was already taking place in the shadows. This event dramatically accelerated the development of intelligence and military confrontation plans in both the West and the USSR. Soviet foreign intelligence, acutely aware of the imbalance of power, prioritized deep penetration. Moscow emphasized the exceptional value of agents within Western government and scientific institutions. The logic was ironclad. To forestall direct threats to the state's existence, it was necessary to learn of the enemy's designs before they even reached the maps of the general staffs. Thus, the point of no return was crossed. No sooner had the victory salutes of 1945 faded than the former allies began a new invisible race. In the very first post-war months, both Soviet and Western intelligence services were feverishly compiling dossiers on one another. American analysis as early as 1946 noted with alarm that Soviet institutes were actively utilizing the labor of relocated German scientists, which could drastically accelerate Moscow's technological breakthrough. Washington was prepared to systematically inform the president of any Soviet threat, however theoretical. The turning point was Winston Churchill's famous speech at Fulton in March 1946. This de facto declaration of the Cold War forced the Kremlin to act preemptively. Soviet foreign intelligence placed its primary emphasis not on brute force, but on its network of agents. Infiltrating Western government and scientific institutions became critically important for forestalling sudden threats. Moscow realized that to survive, it had to know the adversary's plans before the ink had dried on the orders. However, it was not only espionage being discussed behind closed doors. Documents that historians would later dub the Mitrokhin Archive, alongside declassified KGB materials, contain references to preparations for a hot phase of the conflict. This involved the establishment of hidden caches of weapons and equipment abroad, across Europe, Canada, and even the United States. These supplies were intended for sabotage units to be activated in the event of a full-scale war breaking out. While some researchers believe the scale of these operations has been exaggerated, the mere existence of such plans confirms that the world hung by a thread far more often than we realize. Tensions reached a peak by 1949. Against the backdrop of the escalation that would soon lead to the Korean War, the USSR's intelligence services began to seriously discuss scenarios for strikes against hostile infrastructure. These were no longer merely defensive plans. Declassified materials point to preparations for covert information warfare and the development of plans for both mass and precision local attacks, capable of paralyzing the enemy's command structure. Western intelligence services were not idle either. In their dossiers dating back to the early 1950s, the CIA recorded a trend they found alarming. The Soviet Union had begun rapidly expanding its naval and submarine capabilities. Washington viewed this as a clear signal that Moscow was developing the tools not only to defend its own shores, but also to project power across any part of the world's oceans. These assessments underpinned American calculations regarding the potential preemptive use of force, completing the cycle of mutual mistrust. Imagine dusty shelves crammed with files that were never meant to be seen. In the early 1990s, the world was shaken by the publication of the so-called Mitrokhin Archive. This was a colossal collection of notes, secretly copied by Vasily Mitrokhin, a former officer in the KGB's archives department. But what exactly was hidden within these papers, dating from the late 1940s to the early 1960s? The most chilling discovery was not the names of spies, but the detailed plans for physical sabotage. According to these materials, Soviet intelligence was not merely gathering information. The documents claimed that the KGB was preparing for a hot phase of the conflict, establishing a network of caches containing weapons and explosives directly within the territory of NATO countries. The archives include maps and descriptions of these locations across the United States, Canada, and Western Europe. It was intended that at Hour X, special units would retrieve the equipment to carry out strikes against power stations, dams, and oil pipelines. However, it is here that we encounter the primary issue of historical authenticity. Some researchers consider this data to be fully confirmed, pointing out that several caches were indeed discovered by Swiss and other European services. Another group of historians, however, urges caution. They believe that defectors may have exaggerated the scale of threats to increase their value in the eyes of Western handlers, and that the plans themselves often remain mere theoretical developments for a potential Third World War, rather than actual orders for action. To understand such nuances and distinguish facts from spy games, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We uncover what others leave out. It is essential to understand the context of the era. Against the backdrop of the Korean War and the sharp rise in tensions in 1949, the intelligence services on both sides were indeed preparing for the bleakest of scenarios. Declassified CIA files from the 1950s reveal that Washington was seriously concerned not only about a nuclear strike, but also about covert infiltration. American analysis from that period recorded the rapid expansion of Soviet naval and submarine capabilities. In the eyes of the Pentagon, these were seen as the ideal means of delivering sabotage groups to the coast. Nevertheless, when working with such materials, it is critically important to distinguish between three things: verified documents with seals and signatures, analytical forecasts often written as worst-case scenarios, and oral testimonies that may be distorted by memory or ideology. The Mitrokhin Archive and associated leaks paint a picture of a world where war could have started, not with the press of a red button, but with a quiet explosion at a substation on the outskirts of New York or London. Whether these plans were brought to a state of total readiness or remain merely chilling Cold War drafts is a question that continues to provoke heated debate in academic circles. While verbal battles raged in diplomatic offices, a very different drama was unfolding in the quiet of Langley's closed think tanks. Declassified decades later, Central Intelligence Agency reports paint a picture of the mounting anxiety that gripped Washington between 1950 and 1980. Where the Soviet Union had previously been perceived as a land giant capable of reaching the English Channel with an avalanche of tanks, the threat now took on a new, chilling color: the color of the ocean depths. In the 1950s, Western intelligence services began to record what seemed impossible for a country that had recently endured a devastating war: a rapid buildup of Soviet naval capabilities. It was no longer merely a coast guard. Analysts placed reports on the president's desk, stating that Moscow was creating a fleet capable of operating anywhere in the world's oceans. Yet the most unsettling element within these classified files was not the technical specifications of the vessels, but the attempt to comprehend the logic behind their deployment. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, American analysts increasingly documented scenarios of a so-called Soviet first strike. The CIA's reasoning was based on the premise that the burgeoning power of the Soviet submarine fleet might be viewed by the Kremlin not merely as a shield, but as a sword for preemptive action. There were genuine fears in Washington that, at a critical juncture, sensing the threat of an imminent attack, The Soviet leadership might opt for a preemptive strike to disarm the adversary before NATO missiles could leave their silos. These risk assessments fundamentally changed the rules of the game. It was precisely these fears, documented in intelligence reports, that drove NATO to develop increasingly detailed and stringent deterrence plans. It was a vicious circle of fear. Western plans, based on the anticipation of a Soviet strike, became known to Soviet intelligence, which in turn influenced the USSR's defense doctrine, forcing Soviet admirals to prepare for the worst-case scenarios. Historians still debate the interpretation of these documents today. Some argue that concepts of a limited preemptive strike were indeed being developed in Soviet headquarters during the early stages of the Cold War. Others insist that Soviet doctrine was always retaliatory or counter-preemptive in nature, and that the attack plans found in the archives were merely standard military procedures for working through all possible developments, even the most catastrophic. However, it remains an indisputable fact that by the end of the 70s, the confrontation had definitively shifted to the depths of the sea. The ocean became the ideal location for the covert deployment of forces. American intelligence noted with concern that Soviet submarines were becoming quieter, deadlier, and increasingly difficult to track. This created a state of constant tension where any sudden movement or misinterpretation of the adversary's intentions could lead to irreversible consequences. The world teetered on the brink, and this balance was maintained not only by politicians, but also by submarine commanders located thousands of kilometers from their home shores. By the late 1970s, specifically 1979, and the start of the 1980s, the nature of the Cold War confrontation began to shift. While the world anxiously monitored nuclear arsenals, a completely different, little-known scenario was being developed in the quiet of Soviet headquarters. Internal documents from that period, which remained classified as secret for many years, contained specific instructions for high-ranking commanders. They concerned preparations for operations under so-called extraordinary conditions. This terminology concealed detailed plans for a covert deployment of forces. Unlike standard military exercises where armored spearheads break through enemy defenses, the emphasis here was on stealth and speed. Commanders received instruction packets outlining procedures to be implemented even before an official declaration of war. It was a mechanism designed to trigger automatically in the event of a sudden escalation in the international situation, transitioning the army from a peacetime footing to combat readiness without attracting the attention of Western spy satellites. However, the most intriguing element of these plans was the role of special forces. Information leaks that emerged decades later, including through the so-called Mitrokhin archive, shed light on the scale of these preparations. The documents, the authenticity of which historians still debate today, claim that the Soviet Union was preparing infrastructure for sabotage warfare deep behind the potential enemy's lines. This concerned not only Europe, but also the territory of North America. According to these materials, should the conflict enter a hot phase, sleeper agent networks and special forces units were to be activated. Their objectives involve strikes against critical infrastructure, such as power stations, communications hubs, and oil pipelines. Various sources mention the existence of pre-positioned caches containing weapons, radio sets, and maps, hidden in secluded locations across Western countries. These caches could lie dormant for years, remaining undetected by local security services. This aspect of planning reveals the sheer depth of mutual mistrust. While diplomats discussed missile reductions, military strategists operated on the premise that the opening strike might be infrastructural rather than nuclear. Preparing for emergency conditions in the 80s meant being ready to plunge the adversary's cities into chaos mere hours before the main forces entered the fray. It was a shadow war whose plans, fortunately, remained on paper. When the Iron Curtain fell during the 90s and noughties, the world held its breath. Researchers and journalists flocked to the partially open archives of the CIA and the KGB, hoping to find the definitive document, the order to launch World War III, complete with a precise date for a preemptive strike. Yet reality, as is so often the case, proved far more complex and convoluted than any Hollywood script. Mass declassification revealed that a single, top-level official plan to strike first for total annihilation as state doctrine was virtually non-existent in the public record. Instead, historians discovered thousands of pages of operational scenarios. These were not blueprints for aggression, but rather mathematical models of catastrophe. Generals on both sides of the Atlantic were simulating worst-case scenarios. What do we do if the enemy has already pressed the button? However, the information vacuum was quickly filled with sensational revelations. Around the same time, materials emerged related to the so-called Mitrokhin archive, documents smuggled to the West by a defector. They contained chilling details. The KGB and GRU had allegedly prepared caches of weapons and explosives across Europe, Canada, and even the US for a series of sabotage operations during a hot phase of the conflict. These claims triggered a rift among experts that persists to this day. Some historians view these records as proof of Moscow's aggressive intent to launch a covert attack on Western infrastructure. Others, however, point out that many of these plans remained on paper or were the product of bureaucratic fantasies within the intelligence services, aimed at securing larger budgets and demonstrating their importance. In this context, it is crucial to distinguish a confirmed order signed by the Minister of Defense from the rough draft of a field officer. In the 2010s and 2020s, as the initial wave of sensation subsided, painstaking analytical work began. The publication of declassified CIA reports from the 1960s and 1970s shed light on how Washington perceived the Soviet threat. American analysts recorded the growth of the Soviet submarine fleet and concluded that the Soviets were preparing a first strike. However, by cross-referencing these reports with Soviet documents from the same period, modern researchers have concluded that this was a classic perception trap. What the Pentagon saw as preparation for an attack, Moscow viewed as the establishment of a guaranteed retaliatory strike. The doctrine was shifting from pure offense toward a concept of preemptive retaliatory defense, striking only if intelligence gave a 100% guarantee that NATO missiles were already leaving their silos. The most recent discoveries from the period between 2020 and 25 add unexpected, sometimes frightening details to this mosaic. These are no longer just bombing maps, but documents concerning the survival of the system. For instance, surface correspondence regarding the evacuation of key nuclear specialists and biologists has emerged, along with investigation records against Japanese military personnel that the Soviet Union used to analyze biological threats. These papers show that planning revolved not so much around the question of how to win, but rather how not to vanish. If you are interested in the authentic history of the confrontation, stripped of myths, be sure to subscribe to the channel right now. Ahead of us is an analysis of exactly how these scenarios influenced real political crises. Today, historians agree on one thing: having a war plan does not always signify a desire to start one, but it was the fear of the adversary's plans that kept the world on the brink for half a century, a line that fortunately we never crossed. Working with classified archives is like assembling a complex jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces are missing and the other half have been deliberately substituted. During the 1990s and the noughties, when there was a mass declassification of CIA documents and partial publication of Russian materials, researchers were faced with a paradox. The volume of information became colossal, yet the picture did not become crystal clear. For example, the famous Mitrokhin archive, which contains excerpts from KGB records, describes plans for sabotage operations in the USA, Canada, and Europe in the event of a hot phase of conflict as early as the late 1940s and early 1950s. However, historians still debate whether these were approved directives for action or merely theoretical developments for a total war, which defectors presented as a fait accompli to increase their value in the eyes of Western intelligence services. This is where the main trap lies for anyone studying the subject of a preemptive strike. In declassified analytical reports from Western intelligence services from the 1960s and 1970s, one often finds scenarios where the Soviet Union launches a first strike. However, if one closely examines the metadata and context, it becomes evident. More often than not, this was a mirror image of Washington's own fears. American analysts saw the buildup of Soviet submarine power and interpreted capabilities as intentions. This in turn forced the Soviet leadership to develop contingency plans for emergency conditions, mentions of which can be found in documents from the late 1970s and 1980s. But preparing for a worst-case scenario is not the same as in order to be the first to press the button. It is fundamentally important to distinguish between three types of information that are often conflated in sensationalist headlines. The first type consists of verified documents with official seals and signatures. As shown by publications from the 2010s and 2020s, these contain virtually no direct plans for an unprovoked nuclear attack. Instead, they more frequently refer to retaliatory or launch-on warning strikes. The second type involves operational scenarios and war games. In these, military staffs may have practiced even the most aggressive options, but these are training exercises rather than state doctrine. The third type comprises defector testimonies and elements of information warfare. This is the source of myths regarding ubiquitous weapon caches and plans to destroy entire cities, claims that are often impossible to verify with documentary evidence. Summarizing our investigation, it can be said with confidence that the history of the Cold War is far more complex than black and white narratives. Neither side was a mad aggressor dreaming of incinerating the world for the sake of destruction itself. Both Soviet and Western headquarters were manned by pragmatists who calculated the risks. Investigative records, which are only now becoming available in the 2020s, reveal to us not so much bloodthirstiness as a paranoid fear of being caught off guard. A true understanding of history is only possible through critical analysis, where we sift through the propaganda chaff and look at the dry facts, dates, and signatures, recognizing the difference between the possibility of a strike and the decision to launch one.